Hello, my friends. It is Saturday, February 1st, and here are four big stories for today. So we're going to start with a couple of stories in Europe, and then we're going to move and talk about what Trump is doing with executive authority, and that means imposing tariffs on friendly countries, and what he can and can't do with executive authority. And we'll get through that, and then we'll talk about Trump's negotiations with Russia and whether the Russians are actually interested in this at all. So let's start here in Europe. Robert Fico threatens to block EU decisions if Ukraine does not resume gas transit through its territory. Now that's a back-off position from where he was threatening initially to cut off electricity supplies, but now he says that Bratislava would not stop emergency electricity supplies and would not touch humanitarian aid. This could affect Ukrainian citizens, and Slovakia does not want to do that. Kind of looking like he's trying to take a moral high ground where, see, they're cutting us off, but we would never do that to them. And okay, so but this idea that he's threatening to block EU decisions, well, that's the only thing that he has left to threaten. Okay, Moldova started supplying gas to Transnistria. Now, remember, they're cut off from Russian gas in Transnistria, and Moldova has been trying to support them, and Ukraine's been trying to help and whatever. Okay, so delivery started at 8:30 a.m. The quantities pumped into the pipeline system on the left bank of the Dniester are sufficient to maintain pressure. The European Union has also proposed gas to Tariffs as humanitarian aid. It's not clear whether the decision makers in Transnistria will accept the proposal. So we don't know if they want to do this or not. Now they're put in an awkward spot here if they do accept or if they don't. President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, announced on January 27th that the EU will allocate 30 million euros in emergency aid as a package to supply the residents of Transnistria and restore their access to electricity and heating. Okay, so that seems like it's a good thing, except the government in Transnistria doesn't want that because they are cozy with Russia and supported by Russia and have Russian troops there. So wonder how Transnistria residents will react if their authorities refuse this help in order to not provoke the Kremlin. So those government authorities in Transnistria, in this kind of stolen land, they don't want to tick off Putin by accepting it, but they don't want to tick off their people by not accepting it, and their people are cold. So yeah, that's where they are. Okay, another story from Europe. Denmark helps Ukraine artillery production 25-fold, boosted 25-fold. That's pretty amazing. Now, but it's more amazing. Ukrainian factories now deliver howitzers in 60 days at 2.5 million per unit, compared to a wait time and 4.3 million price tags from European manufacturers. So they're doing it faster and more cost effectively. Necessity is the mother of invention. Okay, so that's it from various places in Europe. Let's look at what's going on here in the United States, and we'll start it with this premise here. If you think DeepSeek is some kind of Sputnik moment, it might not be the best time to freeze grants and attack research universities. So what we're talking about is freezing programs, calling it waste, that sort of thing. Now, I don't know that DeepSeek is some kind of Sputnik moment. I think DeepSeek may be a scam / stolen ideas from what we've done with other AI, and I'm not convinced that they're doing something bigger and better. They just kind of stole what was going on with ChatGPT. Okay, but nonetheless, the point still stands. Now, here's Chris Murphy. He's a Democrat senator from Connecticut. So he's philosophically not going to like Trump. So I preface that when I'm saying this. Hearing that Trump is about to double down on the constitutional crisis, a president cannot eliminate an appropriated federal agency by executive order. That's what a despot who wants to steal from the taxpayers' money to enrich its billionaire cabal does. Okay, so let's take away this last inflammatory line. Let's just cut that out. So there is an interesting question. And I say cut that out because, of course, a Democrat senator is not going to like the Republican president, like a Republican senator wouldn't like a Democrat president. Okay, so I'm just trying to neutralize and level the field a little bit. But he's right in the sense that I don't know, there might be a constitutional crisis. So can a president eliminate appropriate federal agency? So if it's an executive agency, the president has the right to do whatever he wants to manage things with an executive agency. But if it's appropriated by the federal government, he is supposed to execute the law that was created by the legislature and signed by a past president to execute getting that where it needs to go. I mean, that's like what his job is. So I'm unsure exactly what's going to happen here. So here's like we see a lot about Trump talking about executive orders, and it looks like he's passing law after law. An executive order is less than a law. It's something other than that. So here's in the United States, an executive order is a directive by the President of the United States that manages the operations of the federal government. So he can't really do anything about what the legislature does or doesn't do, and they can't really do anything about what he does. So if it's managing the federal government, let's say the Secretary of State's Department of this or the Secretary of Energy or the Department of Energy, those kind of things, he has a lot of power there. Okay, Article 2 of the United States Constitution gives the president broad executive enforcement authority to use their discretion to determine how to enforce the law or otherwise manage their resources and staff the federal government's executive branch. Like that's within their prerogative. But if something was already passed and is supposed to be spent and it was duly signed and whatever else, it's supposed to work, except it's a little murky who has the right or if there would be a crisis here. President executive orders, once issued, remain in force until they're canceled. That's why you see at the beginning of every presidential administration, like Trump came in and unwound like 70 or 80 of Biden's executive orders in an instant, right? Like in the first hour. Okay, and then the next president, if they're a Democrat, will come in and unwind a bunch of Trumps in the first hour, and that's the way it works. They can be revoked, adjudicated unlawful, or expire on their terms. At any time, the president may revoke, modify, or make exceptions to any executive order, whether the order was made by the current president or a predecessor. So, but it doesn't have the same power as a law. Like if it's a law passed by the legislature and then signed by the president, and it becomes a law instead of a bill, then it has staying power, and you have to have another legislative created law to undo it, or a court say that it's unconstitutional. Okay, at any rate, so that's what's going on here. Now, with that, Trump announces plans to impose tariffs on the European Union. Oh dear. Okay, so with this, let me preface something. I'm a conservative Republican, an old guard Reagan Republican. I'm not MAGA, and I'm not a rhino moderate either. I'm just like the old style conservative that's not in power now. Like MAGA is a very different thing. And those on the left say, see, he's MAGA. And no, I'm not. And those on the MAGA side of the spectrum say, see, he's a liberal. No, I'm not. I'm neither of those things. But I don't like what I'm seeing here. U.S. President Donald Trump declared that he is absolutely certain about imposing tariffs on the European Union in the future. Now, this is in order to try to balance trade, which I don't think is really necessarily a great goal to begin with here. I don't know why this is so important to him. I mean, I don't see that the European Union is ripping off the United States by a trade imbalance. By not paying their share at NATO, I think that needs to be remedied. But this, okay, at any rate, quote, I am going to impose tariffs on the European Union. Do you want a truthful answer, or am I going to impose tariffs? Do you want a truthful answer, or should I give you a political one? Absolutely. The European Union has treated us horribly, Trump was quoted as saying in a press briefing. Now, Trump also stated that he's going to introduce high tariffs of 25% on Mexican and Canadian goods, 10% on Chinese imports, and adding to that these countries will have no way to stop their implementation, according to Reuters. He mentioned a possible exception for Canadian oil, noting that it would face a 10% tariff instead of 25% he planned on other goods. This just seems like a terrible policy. So you start a trade war, and what happens is they do the same thing to ours, so we can't sell to them. Now, we're not in the same place as some European countries. Like Germany is dependent on exporting. We're really not. We can sell a lot more within our own country and keep things going. But that's still not the thing. We'll pay higher prices if we have tariffs because we'll produce it in the United States, but then we'll also pay higher prices for those things that we produced here than something that we could have imported cheaply. So this is not a great idea. And then you get a backlash as well. The The Albertan oil and gas sector is the lifeblood of the Canadian economy. Recent events should be a wake-up call for Canadians to this reality. Now, his point here is that with more oil pipelines accessing both coasts, we would never be threatened like this. Now, from Alberta, their pipelines go directly down into the United States and into Canada and then down into the United States. They never dreamed that they wouldn't be able to sell their oil in the United States. We want it, right? I mean, historically, we have wanted it. So that's creating kind of an issue for allies. But and then we see things like this. This is Tim Kaine. He's a senator from Virginia, a U.S. senator from Virginia. He was my governor back when I lived in Virginia. He's a Democrat, and he's put out this. Kaine and Coons, Chris Coons from Delaware, introduced legislation to require congressional approval of new tariffs on U.S. allies ahead of expected Trump tariffs. So 25% tariffs expected to go into effect against Mexico and Canada soon, damaging relations with our two closest allies. It says currently the president can impose tariffs on any nation using authority that Congress has granted to combat Congress has created to combat national security risks and address international emergencies. The bill reinstates congressional authority over trade policy and limits the president's ability to unilaterally impose tariffs on our allies. I know that was small print. I'm sorry about that. Okay, so can this actually take? I'm not sure that it will. There's a reason for that. Now, first, should you do this? If you do this to Trump, then when you have a problem down the line and another president needs to address this, he doesn't have the power to swiftly do it. So you give power to the executive to take swift action where the legislature should be very calm and thinking through things. Now, Trump, I don't think, is needing to do this either, and you don't need this swift action. But in the case where you do need it, you could get into a problem. Okay, but beyond that, the Senate might pass this. There might be enough movement in the Senate. The Senate's jealous of its own authority over the executive branch, but I don't think there's any mood in the House to pass this kind of bill, and you need both the House and the Senate to pass the bill, and then it go to the president. So I don't think anything will come of that. Now, Andrew Perpetual commented on the plus side, Americans are about to learn how tariffs work, and it's not going to be pretty if they do go into effect. Okay, now let's look at how Trump is going to be dealing with trying to end the war in Ukraine. U.S. president. Now, before I get into that, why did I go into all that? Because what Trump is doing over here is affecting what's going on over there with the policy in Ukraine. Like, keep ticking off our allies and being obnoxious over there is not necessarily the best way to get to work together. But I think what Trump is trying to do is, just be, I use the term wild card, and it's far more than a wild card, but be something like that in order to kind of keep everyone off balance. That's the best I can understand. I'm not excusing, I'm not apologizing, I'm trying to explain what I perceive. So that's what's going on here. Okay, U.S. President Trump said he intends to stop the war very soon and that he's already in talks with Russia. And he keeps getting pressed about this, and he says this.
It's got to stop. So whatever I can do to stop it, and we are having discussions, yes.
Ongoing, already scheduled and ongoing?
Already talking, yes.
So you've already spoken to Vladimir Putin?
I don't want to say that, but we are having very serious discussions.
Is there a reason you don't want to?
Well, I just don't want to say that. We're having very serious discussions about that war, trying to get it ended.
With Russia.
So there's some with back channels having some kind of communication, but I don't know that Putin has talked to Trump at all. We just don't know that from here, but he's not willing to say whether he has or not. Okay. Meanwhile, his envoy, Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, says President Trump has not yet decided whether to continue to arm Ukraine and increase sanctions on Russia to generate leverage. Enforcement of existing sanctions against Russia have been very weak, especially in the Shadow Fleet, and so we don't know exactly what they're going to do this way or that way yet. Again, I've used a term that Trump is a wild card. It looks promising potentially, but it might not be. We just don't know. But I feel comforted when I hear him say something like this.
When you look at the alliance that is now formed with Russia, with North Korea, with China and Iran, that wasn't there before. It's now together, and they've got either economic or peace treaties signed between both of them out there. That's when you see North Korean troops on the battlefield near Kursk in Russia itself and fighting Ukrainians. And I think we have a good, solid plan to go forward.
Okay, so the Trump administration does not like that at all. And so that's not going to work well for Putin as far as the calculation moving forward. So I'm comforted by that. Zelensky says the war in Ukraine will end when Ukraine secures a just peace. I think that's what we need to be focused on and trying to secure. He goes on and says he emphasized that the peace must honor those who sacrificed their lives, ensuring that they are never forgotten. Justice and accountability are essential, and only when these are guaranteed will the war truly end. Okay, yeah, that's right. And we have to keep our eyes on a just peace. But I don't think that Russia is at all interested in coming to the table. And this is the next big story. The Russian military command, this is the Institute for the Study of War saying this, the Russian military command has shown that it is willing to commit to operations that could take 6 to 9 months to conclude. Russian commanders are likely operating under the assumption or direct knowledge that Putin does not intend to end the war in Ukraine in the near future. Russian commanders do not seem concerned about the speed or consistency of their advances in Ukraine, likely because they believe that the war will drag on until Russia militarily defeats Ukraine. Putin has previously articulated a theory of victory that assumes that the Russian military will be able to continue gradual, creeping advances in Ukraine indefinitely, and has repeatedly indicated that he has no interest in a resolution of the war on any terms but those that he dictates. And I think that's actually a very fair assessment of where the Russians are. Now, you also have to understand that Ukraine has signed 20 ceasefire agreements with Russia between 2014 and 2020, and yet here we are. At least 8 of those were signed during the Trump's first term, and each one was broken by Russia. So what can you really trust about what they're going to do? So Andrew Perpetua, again, Russians will tell you that they want peace. They do not. The Russian government believes peace is submitting to their will and becoming a slave, and any slave who disobeys must be destroyed. The Russians do not want peace. They want to rule. The Russian government must be destroyed is his final conclusion with that. But that's really interesting. They do want peace on their terms, which means subservience of the Ukrainians. He continues a complete ban on Russian imports, a complete ban on exporting to Russia, a complete ban on exporting to countries that export to Russia, and the systemic destruction of Putin and his allies and anyone who supports his regime. Okay, so you know how we were just talking about tariffs at some length. Why were we talking about tariffs? Well, what we should be doing is taking that same kind of mentality of like the tariff ban, especially where it relates to China, and say, okay, we're going to have a systemic destruction of through a ban on exporting to countries that export to Russia. And if you did that, guess what? India and China would stop any support immediately, and a lot of things would come crashing down for Putin. I don't think it would quite do everything, but it would severely put them under stress. And he said if the Russian people truly want peace, they can go into the streets, overthrow Putin, destroy anyone who supported him. Anything less has to be treated as supporting the war. I don't know that they're supporting, but they're certainly not doing anything to get in the way. And so they're giving their tacit support, if nothing else. Okay, we'll conclude with this. On this day, this is Darth Putin. On this day in 1970, the West and the USSR signed their first major gas deal. Less than 2 years after the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. It's part of the German government tradition of not caring that Eastern Europeans live in dictatorships, provided cheap fossil fuels flow. Like that is how they cut deals with the Soviets and what was going on at the time. He goes on and says they'd never get more than 10% of their gas from the Soviet Union. But at the time, they were saying that. By 2021, it was 50% from the USSR or Russia, its legal successor state. Not one of our 6 subsequent wars changed the change through trade mantra. And we did think at the time that like if we're trading with them, they won't invade others, but they keep doing it. So at a certain point, you got to go, maybe we were wrong. It's almost as if putting pragmatic business relationships ahead of ethical considerations isn't the long-term pragmatic or even good for business. Like in the long term, yeah, this is still bad for business. All right. Well, that's all that I have for you today, my friends. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the likes, the shares, and the subscribes. And thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.